My name is Eric Johnson, and I'm a Principal Developer Advocate for Serverless at AWS. And I want to welcome you to the AWS Online Summit. Today we're going to be talking about building serverless applications with infrastructure as code. Before we do that, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. Like I said, I'm a Principal Developer Advocate for Serverless with AWS. I've been a software developer architect for 25 years. I'm pretty old, it's not a typo. I am a solutions architect, have been for about 5 years. I'm a husband and a father of 5, also not a typo. My house is crazy, we have a lot of fun. And I'm a musician. Well, I'm a drummer. Someone argued the musician part, but there you go. You can reach me at EDJGeek on Twitter. I encourage you to follow me and reach out if you have any questions. All right, let's take a look at our agenda for today. So today we're going to do a quick introduction of infrastructure as code. You'll also hear me call it IAC. We're also going to talk about creating your first serverless application with infrastructure as code. We're going to look at making that template reusable, preparing for deployment, deploying your application, and finally, I'm going to walk you through a demo so you can kind of see it all happening live. During this session, I'm going to point out a lot of resources for you. I'm going to give you links, I'm going to give you QR codes, but I don't want you to stress out if you miss one. This is the only one you need. This will have all the other links on it, but again, I'll be calling them out. But if you miss them all, don't worry about it. Just remember this, s12d.com/MAD202 or MAD202. All right, so let's get started. Like I said, we're going to be talking about infrastructure as code. And this is a 30-minute session. And honestly, I could do infrastructure as code for hours upon hours. There's a lot to infrastructure as code. So like I said, I'm going to have some resources going to point you to some places to get a little more about some of the concepts and ideas that we're talking about. Now, when we talk about infrastructure as code, what we're going to do is kind of look at the benefits of it, and then I'm going to climb more about what is it. And I know you're thinking, Eric, that's kind of backwards. We want to know what it is first. But I'm going to do the what is it part with kind of some examples. So the advantages of infrastructure as code, in a nutshell, is you get to instantiate infrastructure using code or configuration files, right? So instead of you pointing and clicking in the console to create infrastructure, you actually store your infrastructure as code. You get to treat these configuration files as software code, meaning you can version, you can roll back, different things like that. It helps you automate the provisioning process, and it helps you eliminate configuration drift through automation. And I know if you've done any development on AWS or anywhere else, you have your development environment, you have a staging environment, you may have gamma, alpha, beta, all those things, however many environments you have to go through before you hit production. And it never fails. Production never looks like development. And there's permutations all the way through. So infrastructure as code helps you keep those environments looking just alike, and it eliminates the drift between those. Now at AWS, we have 3 infrastructure as code services or utilities that we use. The first one is AWS CloudFormation, and this is the core infrastructure as code service at AWS. You can build almost all of AWS services using CloudFormation. The second is AWS Serverless Application, or SAM, and that's built on top of CloudFormation, and we're going to talk a lot more about SAM in just a minute. And then there's the AWS Cloud Development Kit, which allows you to also build infrastructure as literal code. So you can do it in Python, .NET, Node, different things like that. And we'll cover that another time, but mainly we're going to talk today about AWS SAM. Now again, I said AWS SAM stands for the Serverless Application Model, right? And AWS SAM comes in 2 different parts. And if you've ever seen me speak, that's 2. Sometimes I hold up one finger and say that's 2. It's any number I want it to be, but there you go. So it comes in 2 parts, right? Those parts are this. The first is the AWS SAM model. And the model is really this infrastructure as code that we've been talking about. It is a set of serverless resources that you can use to set up your infrastructure. The second part of AWS SAM is the SAM CLI, or command line interface. And this provides tooling for local development, debugging, deploying of your serverless applications. So let's look at an example of infrastructure as code. So this is a SAM template and you can see I've got 20 lines of code. And in these 20 lines of code, I'm going to create 4 resources. I'm going to create an AWS Lambda function. I'm going to create an IAM role. I'm going to create an Amazon API Gateway endpoint, and I'm going to create an Amazon DynamoDB table. Right? Again, with just these lines of code. So what it allows me to do is take these lines of code and produce an actual infrastructure, including the permissions that wrap around that. Right? So you can see here, I've got API Gateway, I've got my Lambda function, I've got DynamoDB table. Also, my API Gateway has the permissions, the least privilege permissions to invoke my Lambda function, and the Lambda function has least privilege permissions to access DynamoDB table based on what I'm going to do. Now, if you want to learn more about SAM, and we're going to cover some more here, but I have a series called Mastering SAM. You can find that at s12d.com/master SAM. All right, so let's look at creating your first application. Now, before we can create anything with SAM, you need to install SAM. If you don't have it installed, don't run and rush to do it right now. But if you want to try this later, if you go to s12d.com/sam-install, it'll walk you through how to install SAM based on the operating system that you use. All right, so actually creating our application. So we're going to use a command line. Remember I said SAM has a command line interface with it. We're going to use a command called SAM init. And when I do SAM init, it's going to allow me to select an AWS managed template, or if you learn how to create your own templates, you choose one of your templates. You select your runtime. That could be Node or Python or Ruby or Java or any of the other supported runtime or a custom runtime. You can select your dependency manager. If you're using something like Java, you can choose between Maven or Gradle. And then you name your application. And what happens is it creates a whole structure for you that looks like this. You have your app, your README file, your events, and these are used for local testing. You have your hello world function, which includes the app code under app.js, and as well as some tests. And finally, the template.yaml file. And this template.yaml file is that model that we were talking about, right? So you use SAM init to get started. And if you ever want to see, hey, what does a good structure look like for Python or for Java, or how do you set this up? Do a SAM init and create a project. And it's a great way to see how things are laid out. If you want to learn more about SAM init, I encourage you to go to s12d.com/SAM init vid. All right, so we've created this template, right? We created we initialized our project and we created the template, but we want that template to be reusable. I mean, this is the whole reason we're doing infrastructure as code, right? Because I don't want to point and click and have to remember how to do that all again. I want to store my infrastructure as code so that I can reuse it in different accounts in different places. So let's look at some of the ways and reasons for doing reusable templates. Like I said, why do we do reusable? And I just kind of mentioned we want to be able to do different places. So let's kind of look at an example of that. Let's say I run a development shop and we're building an application, right? And I have 10 developers, and then we've got a staging environment and a production environment. And so what we're able to do is I can use the same template for each of those. Best practice says I'm going to give each of my developers their own AWS account, but we can share the template. And we can say, all right, everybody who deploys to their account, just use the same template, use the same deploy, which we'll talk about a little bit, and off you go. When we're ready to go to beta or we're ready to go to production, we do the same thing, only instead of a developer doing it, we might actually do it in a CI/CD or continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. I'm going to take a quick drink. All right. So using the same templates to build the same infrastructure ensures consistency across multiple environments. This is that fighting drift. I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure you have too, if you're a developer, you've said, well, it worked on my machine. I don't know what to tell you. And most of the time, it's this drift between environments, and this helps you fight that. Now, to make a template reusable, you say, Eric, that's all well and good, but I may not use the same parameters and the same values across all my accounts. Well, that's okay. We got you covered. SAM has the ability to be very parameterized, right? So when we make our template reusable, we use these parameters. And there's several different types. First is a template parameter. And these are parameters we declare right in the template. And then when we deploy the application, it's going to say, hey, give me the value for these templates. For these template parameters. And these can be, again, added at creation time or update. they can be typed and validated, meaning I can say, hey, this should only be a EC2 instance or something like that, the name of an instance ID. And they're stored on the deployment machine, meaning that as the developer, when I deploy this, I have to fill that information. And it's going to be stored in the environment as well, and they'll show up in the system as well. So the second thing we have are environment parameters. Now, environment parameters can also be added to a Lambda function or multiple Lambda functions. And these are just like you would locally. These are parameters that are available in the environment that can be grabbed at runtime. So in your code, you can pass like a table name or something like that to keep things dynamic, right? These are stored in open text on the console. So these first two are not places to keep your secrets, right? Don't keep your database passwords there. Don't keep, API keys there, things like that. To do that, we want to move to the AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store or the AWS Secrets Manager, or maybe even an AWS App Config. So the AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store, you can actually add values at creation or update, or at runtime. You can actually, from your code, call and grab a value from the Systems Parameter Store. Now, I don't think I would encourage that if you call on it every single time you invoke a Lambda function. And that may be something for the app config, and I'll explain that in a second. It's compatible with some resources for secure keys. Not all resources are compatible with this when we're using secure keys. And you can use encrypted values only at runtime. So most encrypted values won't work at the time of creation. However, with the Secrets Manager, it is more compatible with a lot of services. And so you can have the SAM template grab these values for you, and it'll actually resolve those, and I'll show that in a minute. Or you can grab it from your code. And the final one is the AWS App Config service. And this is really cool. You can set your app configurations, and this works really great with our new Lambda extensions. And so with a Lambda extension, you can actually run an extension outside of the same process as the Lambda function. So it can always be running when your Lambda is invoked. And so your Lambda function can call, you can have the extension grab data from app config every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and keep your Lambda function updated at each invoke, rather than Lambda calling app config each time. So if you need to update data or configurations in your Lambda function a lot, but you don't want to call it all the time, but you don't want to redeploy all the time, app config with the extensions is a good way to go. Another way to parameterize templates is through intrinsic functions and pseudo parameters. And you want to use these, a lot of times when you're building templates, you're going to reference account numbers, you're going to reference the region you're in, different things like that. And you can do that by saying AWS : region, and SAM will actually resolve the region that you're in, or the account that you're in, or the partition. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. Those are pseudo parameters. With intrinsic functions, I can do dynamic references to other parts of the template or elsewhere. For example, one you'll commonly use is the ref, and that means refer to another value. So if I declare a table and I want to have that table name in my environment variables in my Lambda function, some things we've already talked about, I can reference the table and it will return the table name that I can then pass in as an environment variable that the Lambda function can use. And so you start to see that I'm not hard coding any data into my SAM template, so that whether Susie over there deploys it, or Joe over there deploys it, or whoever deploys it, it's specific to the values that they need and are using on however you set your parameters up. So then these templates become extremely flexible, right? So if you want to know more on parameters, I encourage you to take a look at, it's a series I did on secrets, on how to do secrets and when to use them in these different services. And that's a video, s12d.com secrets. And then the app config extension as well, s12d.com app config. And these again will be on the resource page that I linked you to. All right, so preparing for deployment. With SAM CLI, we have a command called the SAM build. And SAM build is going to generate deployment artifacts targeting Lambda execution environments, which is Amazon Linux, or Amazon Linux 2, depending. And it can use containers to build. So if you don't have maybe the right version of Python set up, you can say SAM build, use container, and it'll actually grab the right container to compile Python extension, things like that. All right, so it works, it uses native build tools like .NET or Go to build your Lambda functions or Lambda layers. Nice thing about it is when it's done, each Lambda function is prepared with a self-contained package with code and dependencies. So everything you need to run those Lambda functions is prepared and put together. For more information on SAM build, again, s12.com/SAM build. All right, so deploying your application. So we want to get this out there. So what we can do is we can use, again, SAM comes to the rescue, AWS SAM deploy. And SAM deploy deploys or updates serverless applications in AWS Cloud, right? And so there's two ways you can use this. You can use with S3 based images or container image support for Lambda functions as well. So if I use S3, it's going to store my artifacts in an S3 bucket, and then it'll create the Lambda function using the code in the S3. If I use images, it's going to store my code artifacts in an image in an ECR repository, and then the Lambda function will be backed by that image. And there's some differences in those, so I encourage you to check that out. The images are going to give you more space, but the S3 is going to probably a little faster process. So there's different advantages to what you want to do. It saves the deploy option. So if I go in and fill in my parameter data, things like that, it's going to save those options to a config file, so you don't have to fill it in every time. So you could use a guided deploy to save those, and then from then on, you get just deploy. So what happens is, we can take this and our developers can constantly redeploy to their own development environment. Remember, best practice is our developers are going to have their own environment. So they deploy, iterate. They also use, and we're not going to climb into it too much, but they can use some local testing. And I'll actually show that in the demo on how to do local testing of code. So SAM provides that. And so you don't have to deploy every time you test. You can check locally, iterate a lot, and then deploy to dev. Once they like it, they can commit that to a staging branch and have a CI/CD process, commit to stage or deploy to stage, and then finally you can deploy to prod, all using the same template. There you go. So that's the way we build these multiple environments using infrastructure as code. All right, so let's see some code. I told you I was gonna do a demo, and we're gonna walk you through building an application. So the application we're gonna build is a token generator. And it's just a little idea that I had. Let's say I want to do a contest and I want folks to submit to an application, they get a token back. And then they can try, and when they get that token back, they can try it again, say, hey, check this token to see if you won. And if they won, they get back data, they get back your contact information, that kind of thing. Very simple. There's no security wrapped around it for keeping this simple. I encourage you, always add security, your authentication authorization, those kinds of things. So just to give you an idea on that. So with that, let me show you how to build a serverless application with infrastructure as code. So the first thing we want to do, like I said, to kind of build our applications, we're going to use SAM init. And that's going to then ask me, hey, what templates do you want to use? Do you have some, or do you want to use one of ours? I choose one for that. I choose one for zip, and I choose node, one for node. And then I'm going to name it token generator, okay? So what happens is it builds it out, and then it asks me, what template do you want? So I'm going to use the hello world example. That's usually where I start, and then I build it out from where I want. So let's go in there. And if I just look at the file structure here, you can see what I showed you earlier in the presentation. It's all here. Here's my README, my events, my hello world, my app.js, and so on. So now we do have the template.yaml file in here. So let's go in and take a look. I'm just going to Vim this real quick. This is about all I can do in Vim. You can see here I've got my global section, which we'll talk about in a minute. Here's my hello world function. This describes everything, as well as the outputs to let us know, hey, here's the API endpoint, so we can go to it and test it. All right, so let's go ahead and go to, I've actually modified this for our application. So let's go into Visual Studio Code, and you can see here that I've changed the structure a little bit, right? So I've got in here, I've got some events for testing that I showed earlier. I've got a redeem and a token for each function. I've got my redeem application with the app.js and my token application with the app.js. That's where the code is stored. And I've got my template file. Let's go in there. All right, so a couple of things when we talk about parameters. First of all, let's show I've got here, I've updated this, there's my globals, I've expanded that, we'll get into that. Here's my token function, here's my redeem function, And each one of these are using HTTP API as an event source. It's the same invocation. And here's my DynamoDB table. And this is a simple 2-line. I'm creating this. I'll create a DynamoDB table capacity with just an ID. Now, I refer to, the first thing I'm doing to parameterize this is a parameter that I'm pushing in, and that's contact email, and that'll give the winner an email to contact. And I reference that using a pseudo parameter. An intrinsic function. I use another intrinsic function to grab the DynamoDB table name. Both of these are inserted as environment variables to all the functions in the application via the global section. The last one I use is my Secrets Manager resolver. I use a resolve, I grab from Secrets Manager, and I grab the token key, and it gives me the secret key, and it injects that secret salt key as an environment variable in my account. All right, now that we've got that put out there, let's go ahead and build this. I'm going to use my parallel and cached, and I'm going to build this here real quick. Now, I have sped this up just a little bit, but it's still pretty quick, all right? So now that I've built it, we're going to go ahead and deploy this, if I can spell properly. We're going to go ahead and deploy this using the guided deploy. So I name it token generator, and then it's going to ask me for the region. So I'm going to use US West 2, that's closest to me. That's what I tend to use. For my contact email, because this is just a dev environment, I'm going to put a fake email in here, fake@amazon.com. I prefer you not send things there. That'd be great. And then it asks me, do you want to confirm changes before deployment? It means no, I don't need to. So in this question is say, hey, this function doesn't have any authorization. Are you sure that's okay? Yeah. The same for the redeem function. And then it asks me, do you want to save these in a configuration file? And here's the configuration file. And then the environment is default. And that default is fine for me because that's what I'm going to push. The default is what I want. I want to accidentally go to development, never to production. So my deploy is done, and I've got an endpoint that I can use here to test and see if it works. So let's see if it works. So I jump over to my browser, there we go, and I'm going to go to the endpoint there. And this is just a API-generated endpoint. You can put a custom domain on this. And looky there, we get some data. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and blow that up so you can see it a little better here. And all right, so now you see I have the token, and we're going to grab that, and I'm going to go to /redeem and /token. And I've redeemed my token, and I get my ID, and I get my contact. So everything works. Pretty happy about that. So now that that works, what do we do next? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at testing locally. I don't have to deploy or continue to deploy to test this. So I'm going to invoke using SAM local invoke the token function. I pass it a test event, and I pass it a locals.json file, which I created that has all the environment variables created in production. This allows me to test. I'm actually testing against, well, not production, but in the cloud, my DynamoDB table. Right? So I'm able to test locally, but use cloud resources. You see that it worked. I got my token. I could then test the redeem if I wanted to, but I'm going to show you a different way to test this. What if you build a local website? So you can actually do local start API -n locals.json, and you can see that it's running. It's actually a local version of an HTTP emulator, and I can curl that by hitting localhost :3000 and just hit enter here, and you can see it working on the left side, and I got my response back, and I got a token just as if I were in or hitting the website. I can take that same one, and I can curl it again, but add the /redeem /token, and let's see if the data works. It does. Woo! It works. So we get that. So you see that I'm testing locally. So as I change that, I can change the code, and the code it'll automatically be caught and updated the next time I invoke it. So, all right, so the next thing we need to do is we're going to go ahead and deploy to another account. Okay, so I'm going to do the deploy -g again. If I'm just deploying the same thing, I don't have to do the guided. But I'm going to add a profile because I want it to look to my test account. Okay, same name, same region. I'm going to change the email this time because I want Stageit to be as close to production as it can be. So I'm going to change the email to ericdj, if I can spell right, @amazon.com. That is my real email address. I encourage you to hit me if you need help or on Twitter. Don't need to confirm the changes. This is the changes on deployment. I want to create the role, and then I'm going to tell it it's okay that these are not authorized. I want to save to configuration file. Now here I'm changing the environment. I'm saying this is a staging environment. So now I'm deploying to another account. Crazy. All right, so it's hitting another account. I did speed up these deploys, full disclosure, not too much, but just so you know. All right, so I've got this new API endpoint that I can look at. Let's jump over to my browser, and we're going to do another tab and see how that works. So going into this other tab, we're going to paste this URL and see what data we get back. And it works. Let's blow that up so you can see it a little better. Great. So I'm going to take that token, and again, I'm going to take the same API, and I'm going to add the redeem path. So /redeem /token. I'm passing this as a path parameter, and there's my data. It worked. Now, let's check this out. To prove it's two different accounts, I'm going to copy that data, and I'm going to paste it on the first one we did. Okay, so I paste that in there, and I look, and what happens? That token cannot be found. So that's two different versions of my application going. And with that, we've built our first serverless application. Now, this was a pretty simple example, but you got the idea of how do I create an application? How do I get it ready for for building? How do I get ready to work in multiple accounts? And so we updated the template and looked at how parameters work. We looked at SAM build. How do I take and build an application so that it's all ready? And what SAM build does is just that. It creates those new artifacts. If I'm using if I'm doing SAM local and I change that, it updates that. So. And finally, we deployed. Now, a couple of things on this. So both times you saw me use SAM deploy -G, that's to go through the guided deploy. I can certainly pass flags on the console so that I don't have to do a guided. So if you're doing something through CI/CD, there are flags to handle these. The other thing is if I'm just doing a deploy and I'm not changing any of my parameters, I can just do SAM deploy. I don't have to do the guided, and it goes right in and uses all the parameters from that template. To choose between the environments, I say SAM deploy, and then I do --config environment, config -environment, and then I pass stages. So --config -env space staging, and that will deploy to my staging. But I made it so I have to be deliberate about that because Eric will deploy to the wrong account. So I'm deliberately making myself add those flags if I want to push it to staging or production. Hopefully that was a pretty simple process and it made sense. We were able to create the application, deploy the application. We did some local build. We did some testing locally where I was able to, right there with curl, get the data information that I needed. I was able to run a local version of HTTP API to get to respond that, to test with a local client. So hopefully you kind of get that idea of here's how fast I can build serverless applications. I encourage you to check out serverlessland.com where we have a lot more on this. This is a website maintained by the Serverless Developer Advocates, me being one of them, and we put all our blogs, all our videos out there. So I encourage you to check this out and get more information on some of the concepts and and techniques that I discussed today. If you want to learn more, you join the summit to learn, right? And you can keep learning beyond the summit with resources from AWS training and certification. You can see here we have online free digital courses, including Amazon EKS and Service Solutions. You can dive deep in classroom training from accredited AWS expert instructors and a lot more. I encourage you to check this out, to take advantage of training. Don't try to go it alone. Take advantage of training. If you do have questions, though, like I said, my name is Eric Johnson. You can find me at EDJGeek on Twitter. Here's my email. That's my actual email, ericdj@amazon.com. Shoot me an email. I'll help when I can. And I encourage you to learn serverless, build it with a framework, and enjoy it. Please take a moment to fill out the survey so we can know how I did and how I can do better.